Great. So Paul, thank you so much for the introduction, and I really appreciate being invited back to spend time with you guys this morning. And I just want to start by telling you why I'm here. I have two children. I've got a daughter who's now a sophomore in college and a son who's a junior in high school. And I'm really concerned about their futures and the future of other young people if we don't address the climate crisis. So this picture was taken in front of El Capitan last summer in Yosemite. And the haze is not just my poor photography. There was a fire actually burning in Yosemite while we were there. And the Dixie fire was also raging out of control while we were there. And periodically we were downwind of that and getting quite a bit of smoke. So that brings me to the second reason I'm here. The toll that climate change is taking on the world's ecosystems is really devastating. This view of the Earth, the famous blue marble photo, was taken from Apollo 17 as the crew was traveling toward the moon in 1972. And it's just here to serve as a reminder of our common home. And I just want to acknowledge here that the first part of this presentation is difficult. What we're facing is heartbreaking and dramatic. I don't even have the words to really express what we're facing right now. But I think people of faith are well qualified to face a difficult truth. That was, part of what this morning's service was about. And so when we get to the second part of the presentation, that's where we'll be talking about solutions, hope, and action. So I'm sure you already know a lot of this, but I just want to start by giving an overview of what's causing the climate crisis. So to understand that, we first have to take a look at the Earth's atmosphere. Now, this picture was taken from the space station. It's of the sun shining through the atmosphere, which is actually quite thin. And the great scientist Carl Sagan likened the thickness of the atmosphere to a coating of shellac painted on the outside of a globe that you might find in a classroom or in your home. So you're probably familiar with how humans have been changing our climate system by taking carbon out of the Earth and putting it into the atmosphere, but I'll go through that science briefly. Solar radiation in the form of light waves passes through the atmosphere. Most of this radiation is absorbed by the Earth and warms it. The remainder of the solar radiation is reflected back to space by clouds, atmospheric particles, and bright ground surfaces like sea ice and snow. But some of it is trapped by the natural greenhouse gas layer, and that's a blessing because that's what has kept temperatures on the Earth within comfortable boundaries for the life forms here, including us. So the problem, though, is that human activities are thickening this greenhouse gas layer. And as it gets thicker, more and more of this outgoing radiation is trapped and the Earth is heating up. And that's basically what global warming is. So how are we thickening this layer? There are many ways. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases come from a variety of sources. Transportation, the burning of coal, gas, and oil, and the burning of vegetation and forests all contribute to increased greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture, particularly animal agriculture, also plays a role, as does mining. And we're also seeing methane released by the thawing permafrost, which we'll discuss more later. The energy trapped by man-made global warming pollution is now equivalent to exploding 600,000 first-generation atomic bombs every day of the year. The largest source of global warming pollution is the burning of fossil fuels. And as you know, humans haven't always lived this way. Here you can see how our carbon emissions increased as the Industrial Revolution changed our society, and that since World War II, emissions have been going up dramatically. The second largest cause of human-induced climate change is methane, and atmospheric methane concentration has also increased dramatically. It lives in the atmosphere for a shorter period of time, but over a 20-year time frame, each molecule of methane traps 86 times more heat than a molecule of carbon dioxide. And we'll talk more about methane emissions later in the presentation as well. Plastic pollution is a growing concern, so I just wanted to take a few minutes to discuss the role that plastics play in climate change. Petrochemicals are rapidly becoming the largest driver of global oil consumption, and they're set to account for more than a third of the growth in oil demand to 2030 and nearly half to 2050. 75% of petrochemical production is for the manufacturing of more plastic. Plastic production and incineration already produces the annual emissions equivalent of 189 coal-fired power plants. And the toxic chemicals emitted from plastic production have been linked to increased rates of cancer, asthma, reproductive health issues, central nervous system damage, and other severe health impacts. Communities in close proximity to production sites, which are often low-income communities or communities of color, suffer the health effects of exposure to these chemicals. The production of petrochemicals, which turns oil and gas into the raw materials for products such as plastics, is expected to surge over the coming decades. This chart shows the oil demand growth forecasts of various sectors of the economy from 2020 to 2040. As the demand in some sectors declines due to increased efficiency and the transition to clean energy, fossil fuel companies are banking on the petrochemical industry and plastics to make up the difference. And plastics emit greenhouse gases at each stage of their life cycle, from when fossil fuels are first extracted to make the plastics to when they are managed or mismanaged as a waste product. We can't let plastics become Plan B for the fossil fuel industry. And if you want to learn more about the connection between plastics and climate change, you can find a report on the Beyond Plastics website. Last August, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, came out with a report saying it's unequivocal that human activities are warming the planet. Now we're going to look at the worsening consequences that are the result of this human-caused warming. And on this chart, you can see how average surface temperatures have changed in the last 140 years and that the warming trend has been going up dramatically. This chart shows the 20 hottest years as of 2020. We now know that 2021 tied with 2018 as the 6th warmest year on record. And so the hottest of all years have been the last now 8 years. Last summer, the 2021 Pacific Northwest heat wave was the most anomalous extreme heat event ever observed on Earth since records began 2 centuries ago. And of course, we know that the rest of the world is being impacted too. There were quite a few areas of the world last summer where the temperatures exceeded 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Vulnerable populations are particularly at risk from these devastating high temperatures. 93% of the extra heat trapped by man-made global warming pollution goes into the ocean. And although it's not shown on this chart, ocean heat content also set a new record again in 2021. And high ocean heat content has several consequences. One of those is on the severity of storms. You probably all remember Hurricane Ida, which made landfall in Louisiana as a Category 4 storm. Hurricane Ida crossed waters that were up to 7 degrees Fahrenheit higher than normal, and that heat extended deeper than in other areas of the Gulf. It caused tremendous damage in the coastal areas of Louisiana and in other nearby communities. And then the storm continued northward up the eastern part of the United States. It slammed into New Jersey and New York and dropped 9.5 inches of rain in some places. All told, Hurricane Ida and its remnant storms killed at least 84 people in the US South and in the Northeast. Here in New York, risk of Hurricane Sandy intensity events are increasing. They used to be a 1 in 500 year event. It is now a 1 in 25 year event, and depending on how quickly we address the climate crisis, it's expected to become a 1 in 5 year event between 2030 and 2045. And of course, we know that other countries are experiencing this devastation too, and many of them are less equipped to deal with the aftermath of these storms. As temperatures increase, the oceans evaporate more moisture into the sky. Warmer air can hold a lot more water vapor. With each additional 1 degree C of temperature, the atmosphere's capacity to hold water vapor increases by 7%. And there's already 5% more water vapor over the oceans than there was only 30 years ago. So this means that we're starting to see larger atmospheric rivers that carry a tremendous amount of water vapor that is evaporated off the oceans. Now, atmospheric rivers are not a new phenomenon, but the amount of water that they are carrying has increased dramatically. This is a photo of one of those rivers that stretches from Hawaii to Silicon Valley. And already the average atmospheric river carries as much water as 25 Mississippi rivers. So the downpours are getting bigger, and we're starting to see enormous rain bombs like this one in Midland, Texas, which drop a large amount of rainfall in a short amount of time. There have been 22 1 in 1,000 year downpour events in the US since the May of 2010, so obviously these are no longer 1 in 1,000 year events. One of them occurred in Tennessee last summer and was devastating to local communities. So looking at this graph, you can see how dramatically more often these events are occurring worldwide. New York City experienced several events last year that caused the subways to flood, including this flooding induced by Storm Elsa. The same extra heat that evaporates more water from the ocean, causing bigger downpours and floods, pulls moisture even more quickly from the soil, causing longer and deeper droughts. In September of last year, 93% of the US West was experiencing moderate to exceptional drought, and 6 states were at 100% in drought. Nearly half of California was in exceptional drought conditions. And Lake Mead was at its lowest level since it was filled in the 1930s. Much of the Pacific Northwest and the Western United States is still in a drought condition. The situation was temporarily alleviated somewhat by storms in November when the Pacific Northwest was hit simultaneously by a bomb cyclone and rain from an atmospheric river. A bomb cyclone is a storm that rapidly intensifies due to a quick drop in atmospheric pressure, and this storm had a record low pressure for the Northwest coast of 942 millibars. It brought flooding and landslides, particularly to areas that had been devastated the previous summer by fires. When you combine drought with increased heat, you have a particularly dangerous situation. And these are two of the largest fires that were burning in Northern California last summer. Entire towns in the Northwest are being devastated by fire. And smoke from the fires poses a health hazard to people across the country, including here in New York. One way to understand the climate crisis is to look at climate as a kind of engine that's distributing heat from the tropics to the poles. As a system, it tends to even out the temperature as much as it can, and it does that through ocean and wind currents and big storm systems. But because of increased temperatures in the Arctic sea ice loss, and glacial melting in places like Greenland, this pattern is changing. This graph shows the dramatic decline of Arctic sea ice. It's fallen off a cliff, and it won't be long before there's no ice in the Arctic Ocean in the summertime. As more fresh water is released into the ocean due to melting sea ice and glaciers, it's slowing down the ocean transport system. And a new study has found an almost complete loss of stability in the system that drives the Gulf Stream and other Atlantic Ocean currents. So this would impact weather systems on both sides of the Atlantic. Climate tipping points are theorized thresholds of no return from dramatic and irreversible changes to Earth's climate system, and the shutdown of the ocean conveyor belt is one of those tipping points. Another system that's in danger of disruption is the Northern Hemisphere jet stream. The polar vortex is an area of very cold air and low pressure above both of the Earth's poles. It's characterized by very strong winds, tens of thousands of feet up in the atmosphere, that help keep the cold air at the poles. Sometimes the vortex becomes unstable and the jet stream becomes wavy. This can lead to very cold air spilling from the poles and into other regions of the globe. And again, this is not a new phenomenon, but these events do appear to be increasing, and scientists are working to understand how this might be related to climate change. So one of these events occurred in February of last year. For the first time ever, the entire state of Texas was under a winter storm warning. And I actually am originally from Texas. This is a photograph of my parents' backyard in Austin. The freeze, as I'm sure you're well aware, overwhelmed the ill-prepared power grid, and impact to Texans was absolutely devastating. My parents were lucky. They were without power or water service for several days, but the temperature in their home stayed above freezing. It got down to the high 30s, but it didn't freeze. And they had stocked up on food and drinking water. So my mother gathered snow and brought it inside to melt so that they could flush toilets and supplement their bottled water supply. Many other Texans were not as lucky. Texas put the death toll at 246 deaths, spanning 77 counties, and the age of victims ranged from less than a year to 102. Close to 2/3 of the deaths were due to hypothermia. A report published in September of 2021 concluded that Arctic change is likely an important cause of a chain of processes involving what they call a stratospheric polar vortex disruption, which ultimately results in periods of extreme cold in northern mid-latitudes. So as I said, this is really emerging science, but it does look like that changes in our climate are partly driving this. So I want to touch briefly on some of the impacts of climate change to global systems, such as food supply, and how those disruptions are impacting human migration. Observed climate change has already affected food security due to warming, changing precipitation patterns, and greater frequency of some extreme events. The IPCC report released in February said that climate change will increasingly undermine food security. And here's a farmer from Honduras who was headed to Houston because his farm could no longer support his family. The 2020 hurricane season drove 10,000 additional migrants northward out of Central America. And globally, 10.3 million people were displaced by extreme weather from September of 2020 to February of 2021, which for that time period was 4 times more than by conflict. The number of people forced from their homes by extreme weather is predicted to increase dramatically, particularly if we're unable to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we haven't even started talking about the millions and millions of people at risk from sea level rise. Low-lying island nations are at risk from droughts, saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies, and collapses in tourism well before the sea covers the land. Societal disruption caused by climate change is putting our national security at risk. In September, the US Department of Defense stated that climate change is exacerbating existing risks and creating new security challenges for US interests. And here's a graph that quantifies the increase in extreme weather catastrophes. Of course, we know that all types of infrastructure are at risk from extreme weather. And these events, in addition to being very costly to human life, are also costly in terms of dollars. The US has sustained 310 weather and climate disasters since 1980, where overall damages and costs reached or exceeded $1 billion. So the cost of these 310 events exceeds $2.1 trillion. Another system vulnerable to the climate crisis is health. Leading medical journals released this joint statement last September saying that the science is unequivocal. A global increase of 1.5 degrees C above the pre-industrial average and the continued loss of biodiversity risk catastrophic harm to health that will be impossible to reverse. Remember the Pacific Northwest heat wave that I mentioned earlier? Take a look at the spike in hospitalizations at the height of the heat wave. I find this chart to be really amazing. Climate change is disrupting natural ecosystems in a way that is making life better for infectious disease. As the climate changes and humans expand further into Earth's remaining wild places, 5 new infectious diseases are emerging on average each year, and COVID-19 may be one of these diseases. I'll cover a couple of additional climate tipping points, including the shift of the Amazon from rainforest to savanna. Global tree cover loss is happening around the world and is due to a variety of causes. The problem is particularly bad in Brazil, and when we get to the solutions part of the presentation, I'll talk more about some of the things the world is trying to do to address this crisis. And I mentioned methane release from permafrost thaw earlier in the presentation, and it is another tipping point. Emissions from the Arctic, primarily from thawing permafrost, are likely now on par with the annual emissions of Japan or Russia. The climate crisis is also an extinction and biodiversity crisis. 40 to 60% of fish species are at risk by the end of the century, as ocean, lake, and river waters will be too warm to support them during the spawning and embryonic stages. Populations of marine vertebrates declined 49% on average from 1970 to 2012, and we're now at risk of losing up to 50% of all land-based species in this century. In August, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the latest science on the climate crisis a code red for humanity. There's no going back from some changes in the climate system. However, some changes could be slowed and others could be stopped by limiting warming. And the latest IPCC report released in February contained an even more dire warning, saying that any further delay in concentrated global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to secure a livable future.
This is a after church program.
Oh, okay.
That we have an Earth Care team.
Oh,
And they
cool.
recommended this lady who's doing an after worship Zoom here with graphics as well as facts, because she's a climate specialist.
So we have the solutions at hand, but we have to work to deploy them as quickly as possible. The good news is that scientists have found that if we halted our net carbon dioxide emissions, about half the human-made carbon dioxide would be taken out of the atmosphere and absorbed into the upper ocean and trees within about 30 years. Traditional indigenous territories encompass up to 22% of the world's land surface and harbor 80% of the planet's biodiversity. It's essential that the sovereignty of indigenous peoples be respected and that they hold positions of influence in government and in UN talks. At COP26 last fall, 141 countries recommitted to a declaration on forests and land use that includes support for smallholders, indigenous peoples, and local communities who depend on forests for their livelihoods and have a key role in their stewardship. Some countries, including the United States, also signed a global forest finance pledge in order to help forest countries address the drivers of forest loss. As a species, we've experienced the agricultural revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the Digital Revolution. And we're now at the beginning of the Sustainability Revolution, which we must undergo if we're to survive as a species. Renewables are set to account for 95% of the net increase in global power capacity through 2025. This is largely due to the fact that the cost of solar and wind energy has fallen dramatically, and many places it's already cheaper than fossil fuels. Low initial costs also make small solar systems affordable in developing countries. Across Europe as a whole, renewables now produce more electricity than all of the fossil fuels. The invasion of Ukraine has highlighted the need to move away from fossil gas for reasons of national security and global stability. So note that this graph is for electricity and not for the heating of buildings. So Bill McKibben published in February an essay entitled "Heat Pumps for Peace and Freedom," where he argues that President Biden should activate the Defense Production Act to produce electric heat pumps in quantity to ship to Europe to help them reduce their dependence on imported gas. Fossil fuel interests are calling for more fracking and drilling to reduce dependence on Russian fossil fuels, but the dire need to address the climate crisis demands that we not invest in additional fossil fuel development. We have to rapidly deploy clean energy solutions. In the United States in 2020, 81% of new capacity was from solar and wind. In China, that number was 63%, and in India, that number was 69%. Over 300 global companies have made a commitment to go 100% renewable. So let's look at some of the numbers behind this transition. Solar installations are increasing exponentially, and here's the growth in wind energy. The price of battery storage also continues to decline while demand is dramatically increasing. And the building efficiency market is seeing higher and higher revenues. These developments are leading to job creation. In fact, investments in renewables and energy efficiency create 3 times more jobs on average than investments in fossil fuel technologies. We're also seeing a dramatic increase in electric vehicles, and electric vehicles are rapidly reaching price parity in many countries, including here in the United States. There are also a growing number of locations that are phasing out the sale of fossil fuel cars, and this includes New York, which enacted legislation to eliminate gasoline-powered car and truck sales by 2035. And at least 35 cities have committed to buying only zero-emissions buses starting in 2025. Well, I think my PowerPoint, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. Temporarily locked up. In the US, public transit investments create 70% more jobs per dollar invested than spending on highways. Policies that accelerate deployment of climate solutions are essential. So we're going to take a look at some of those policies now. It's essential that we have this international cooperation and that the US leads by example by enacting policies that do our part to keep global temperature rise at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The US legally rejoined the Paris Agreement 30 days after President Biden was inaugurated as president. There was an interesting report put out by the Rhodium Group last fall on the subject of where our current policies are in the United States and the gap between current policies and the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that we need to see by 2030. So you can see that there is a significant gap here. Now, how can we close that? The group identified a joint action path, which includes a suite of policies, including state action, federal regulatory action, and federal legislative action. Their report stated that if Congress fails to act, the 2030 greenhouse gas emissions target may be in jeopardy. Measures in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed last fall and the House passed reconciliation bill enable and accelerate clean technology deployment and on their own cut emissions significantly. The provisions that do that are predominantly the clean energy tax credits for wind, solar, batteries, and EVs, and funding a national climate bank or a greenhouse gas reduction fund. Federal legislation should also include justice provisions to address systemic inequities that are embedded into our current economy and to support fossil fuel communities in transition. Those justice provisions are also currently included in the climate package that the House passed as the reconciliation bill. However, these investments are in jeopardy. They are not getting any support from Republican senators, and Senators Manchin and Sinema have also blocked the passage of the Build Back Better Act. The fossil fuel industry is also using the war in Ukraine to press for expanded fossil fuel infrastructure instead of clean energy investments. But you can take action in this moment. You can call and email your US senators and President Biden and ask them to ensure that the bold and substantial climate investment and justice provisions already included in the bill that the House passed are passed this spring, and let them know why it's important to you. Spread the word to friends and family, especially family that may live in other states whose senators may not be supportive of this type of climate action. Now we're going to take a look at New York State policies that accelerate solutions. In 2019, New York passed a landmark climate law that commits the state to net zero emissions by 2050, with a goal of 40% emissions reduction by 2030, as well as other goals related to electricity generation and energy efficiency. It also mandates that at least 35% of spending must benefit frontline environmental justice and low-income communities. Last year, the State Department of Environmental Conservation released an estimate of greenhouse gas emissions by sector. As you can see, building-related emissions made up about 1/3 of the total, followed by transportation emissions. The draft scoping plan, which establishes New York's pathway to reaching the goals set forth in the legislation, was released by the state's Climate Action Council in December. The plan will shape state legislation, regulatory decision-making, and state budget-making in the coming years, including this year. By law, it must be updated every 5 years. The draft includes a benefit cost assessment, and the main thing to note here is that climate mitigation cases show a net positive monetary benefit to the state of between $90 and $120 billion when considering the value of avoided greenhouse gas emissions and health co-benefits, in addition to cost savings from reduced fossil fuel. So even though this is going to be a very expensive transition, it will be cheaper than not undergoing the transition at all. So the Climate Action Council will be holding public hearings on the plan and accepting public comments regarding the plan during 2022. It's a very long plan, but you can go to climate.ny.gov to read it. There is a summary plan, which is shorter, and you can keep up with commenting opportunities. It's an extensive economy-wide plan that lays out transformative changes that are needed to meet our state climate goals. So I just urge you to stay informed about its content to better understand the changes that will come and how that's going to affect all of us as we go through this transition, and also how you can do your part in the transition. Here's an action that you can take today. The New York State budget, which was due actually last Friday, will probably be finalized on Monday. The Senate version of the budget includes the All Electric Buildings Act, and Governor Hochul's budget also includes a version of that. However, the Assembly budget does not, and this bill is critical to cutting the 1/3 of New York State's greenhouse gas emissions that come from buildings. So in the last 2 weeks, we've seen an extraordinary display of the fear the fossil fuel industry has of climate legislation working in New York. Last week, the American Petroleum Institute initiated a well-funded campaign robocalling the Capitol to stop environmental legislation. There are other fossil fuel interests who are also pouring money into New York State to try to fight progress on these bills, especially this All-Electric Building Act. So you know you're doing something right in addressing climate when the fossil fuel industry starts to pay attention and counter your campaign. So you can help to counter the fossil fuel campaign by making calls today to Governor Hochul, Speaker Hastie, Majority Leader People-Stokes, and to your state representatives, especially your state assembly members, and ask them to put the All-Electric Building Act into the state budget. And since Westminster is close to the neighborhood of Sheridan Hollow and the state capitol complex, I want to spend a few minutes on some exciting developments in those areas. For more than a century, residents of Sheridan Hollow and nearby communities have borne the pollution and adverse health impacts of housing the Sheridan Hollow steam plant that heats and cools state-owned facilities. This plant over the years has burned coal, oil, garbage, and is currently burning polluting fracked gas. A bill has been introduced to address this historic injustice. It would require state facilities in downtown Albany, including the Capitol building and the Empire State Plaza complex, to be entirely powered, heated, and cooled by renewable energy, thus relieving the burden placed on the residents of Sheridan Hollow while establishing the state as a leader in the green transition required by state legislation. And I understand that the Earth Care team have been having conversations about this within the church community, and that you're looking into converting the church's current heating oil system to an electric heat pump system, which is an excellent way to reduce your own greenhouse gas emissions and also address the building greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. So in addition, there's a separate effort to bring clean heating and cooling technologies to the residents of Sheridan Hollow. Aztec Geothermal, along with several partners, have received a $100,000 NYSERDA grant for a feasibility study regarding a district geothermal heating and cooling system in Sheridan Hollow. Geothermal heating and cooling systems are powered by electricity, so they eliminate the need for on-site burning of gas or oil. And because they take advantage of the Earth's constant thermal temperature, they use less electricity than air source heat pumps. I couldn't find a great graphic for a district geothermal system, so I'm using this one, which shows an individual system. So I just want to close with a few other ways you can deepen your personal commitment to Earth Care and continue to green your congregation here at Westminster. I highly advise all of you to join an organization advocating for climate solutions. There's so many great organizations across the country that are national, but also that are local here to the Capital Region. There's also a great app called the Climate Action Now app that you can download on your smartphone and use to take climate action. Ned Trudeau is a master at using that Climate Action Now app, so I encourage you all to speak to him about it. I'm happy to talk about that app more also during the Q&A. And also continue to green your own residents and your congregation. As you know, a lot of the buildings here in New York State that are responsible for this, you know, 1/3 of our carbon emissions are owned by residents. So it's important for all of us to do our part to get energy audits and to develop a plan for converting our homes, our businesses, you know, our church communities into clean heating and cooling. And NYSERDA has a variety of resources to help people do that. Also, composting food waste is an easy way to reduce methane emissions from landfills. Sustainable Saratoga has some great resources on their websites They've got a YouTube video that explains how to set up a backyard composting system. But if that's not for you for whatever reason, they also have a list of composting resources and services in the capital region that you can take advantage of. And I just want to end by just celebrating you and your congregation and the work that you're doing here. I'm tremendously grateful to your commitment to earth care and to climate justice. And I'll just say here, I took this picture of your church before the pandemic a few years ago, and that's my dad looking up at your church. He's a former Presbyterian minister, so whenever we are out together, and even when he's not with me, I take photographs of Presbyterian churches and I text them to him. It's just kind of one of our funny family things that we do. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then we can have questions and answers if anybody is interested.
Sanctuary here. This is the time for questions and answers. So let's see. Sue is here to kind of look out for people on Zoom raising questions, and I can be in touch with them. So let's find out who's got questions or comments. Here's Thomas Peters over to Thomas.
Your PowerPoint is like an inconvenient truth, point 3 or something like that. But we get access to that.
Did you hear that? Or?
I heard part of it. So yeah, so I am a trained climate reality leader with the Climate Reality Project. And as part of climate reality training, we have access to all of the slides that Al Gore uses. In fact, internal to climate reality, they are called Al Gore's slide deck. There are actually over 500 slides in the deck. And as climate reality leaders, we pick and choose what we want to use. And then we also add a lot of our own slides. As you can see, I added all of the New York State specific and Sheridan Hollow specific slides. There is on Climate Reality's website a Truth in 10 presentation that is available for anybody to download. It's available to the general public. And I can send a link to that to Paul to distribute to you guys if you're interested. I can find it on the website. A lot of what I presented today, I can't share because Climate Reality has intellectual property agreements with the people who let us use their photographs and things like that. So I apologize for that. I can share with you any slides that I myself created, and I'm happy to do that if you guys are interested.
Anybody on Zoom?
While we're waiting, I should also say, I invite all of you to take climate reality training. You don't have to be an expert. It's designed to help equip everyday people to go back and talk about climate change in their own communities. So for the last 2 years, Climate Reality has been doing virtual trainings. The next one is actually in June. It's in Las Vegas. Unfortunately, it's a long way from the East Coast. But I'm hoping they will have additional trainings this year, either virtual or perhaps some more in person that are closer to New York. But if you sign up on Climate Reality's website, you can get an update on when those trainings occur.
Laura, I have a question. Last Monday evening, I attended a webinar that included Bill McKibben, and he made the statement that he's pretty discouraged about what the president and Congress are able to do right now. And there's a movement going on this year to urge people to boycott fossil fuel contributions to fossil fuel industry. For example, banks. If your bank contributes to the fossil fuel industry, consider withdrawing your money and going to another bank that does not. If your credit card company contributes to the fossil fuel industry, consider cutting up your credit card and going somewhere else. And apparently there's going to be an event at the end of the year, a cutting up your credit card event, a public thing that will take place at various banks around the capital region. And if you are so bold as to change to some other bank and are willing to abandon the bank we have now, that's an event. Have you heard about that? And are you aware of that movement?
I have heard about that. I strongly support that. We do need to move money out of supporting fossil fuels and over to supporting clean energy infrastructure. I know Bill McKibben has started a new group called Third Act that is designed, really aimed specifically, I think, at baby boomers and the silent generation who hold a lot of the wealth in the country, asking them to move their assets, as you said, out of banks who support and lend to the fossil fuel industry and into banks who are not as active in that. So I do strongly support that. Again, with respect to the Climate Action Now app, one of the organizations that puts actions on that app is Stop the Money Pipeline. So there are a lot of actions on that app that are related to contacting banks and others who are funding the fossil fuel industry and ask them to divest from that industry.
Paul is enlisting you to, I guess, wrap up. Laura, thank you so much. Really important to people to listen and also to just talk with other people and have conversations. It's sobering what you brought to us, but we also have to remind that the aspects of hope and the idea that people can make individually hold on to that. And we truly appreciate all the time that obviously put into this whole subject and everything that we work forward. Very appreciative. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you. I greatly appreciate you guys inviting me back, and I'm happy to return and have a conversation, formal or informal, whenever you're interested. And these things are constantly evolving. I think the next IPCC report is actually due out tomorrow, and it's focused on climate mitigation. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of news stories about that for all of us to read and digest.
All right, thanks everybody, and thank you especially Laura. Blessings to you and your congregation as you partner with others and we're a sister congregation in this together as well. All right, thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Thank you all again. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.